people who will tell you that the Crusades were waged for cynical reasons. It was about second sons trying to get land and this sort of thing. If that was the case, what they're doing, these people with this interpretation, is they're completely missing the extreme labor that went hand in hand with crusading. So first of all, a lot of these men who were landed and were rich, and Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, who were captains of the First Crusade, they actually mortgaged their land. And some of them were in debt just to raise money so they can go crusading. And they already had land. They lost their titles. They gave it up just to go and fight in the Holy Land. One. Number two, you know what? Why can't they, if you want to be cynical, why don't you just attack your neighbor like they had been doing? Why travel thousands of miles on horseback or on foot for the average pilgrim through dangerous enemy territory, where most crusaders and the people who went on the First Crusade, about 70% of them either died or actually gave up and went home just from the journey itself, because of the starvation, of the disease, lack of water. But so my point is, there's a lot of easier ways to have gone about it than doing this. And also another very obvious difference between the Crusaders and the Muslims, which really highlights the idealism or the idealistic nature of Crusaders. That is to say that they weren't out just to conquer. They were out specifically out to reconquer the Holy Land itself. And that's not what Muslims ever did. What Muslims always did is, right from their first base, beginning in Arabia, they attacked their immediate neighbors, Egypt, Syria, Iran, Persia. And then once they consolidated those areas, then they attacked the next region. So from Egypt, they would attack Libya and so forth. And that's the smart way to do it, of course, because you have your reserves right there. You're not thrown in the middle of enemy territory. That's why it was much more successful and pragmatic, the Islamic conquest, because it wasn't idealistic. It was just, who's the easiest target? Oh, it's the guy right next to me. I'm going to attack him. The Crusaders didn't do that. They weren't out to conquer anyone. They were out to liberate the very important piece of Holy Land to them, because that's where Christ walked. So that's where he was crucified, resurrected, and that sort of thing. So it was very idealistic. They threw themselves in the lines. Then getting there itself was a horrific journey that most of them died from, and they lost so much money. So ultimately what we're saying here is that for the First Crusade, definitely, and most of the other ones as well, too, but definitely because we're talking about the First Crusade, the number one reason was sincere piety. In chapter 1 of that book, Defenders of the West, is dedicated to Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke Godfrey, and he is really paradigmatic of what we're talking about, very idealistic, very impressive. He was landed. He was the Duke of Lorraine. He wasn't the oldest son, but he became Duke through, his uncle actually favored him for whatever reason and made him his, heir. And, despite that, he sold everything, mortgaged everything, raised, whatever money he could, raised an army, and went on to the First Crusade. Very pious according to the sources, including contemporary sources. And again, this is the irony. But when you read the sources, what you get is a humble man, a pious man, a strong man. I quote how he was raised, him and his brother, by their mother, and it's very typical for knights. From birth to about 7. This is when they learn about God and religion, and if they're going to learn any letters, it would be around that time. And then from 7 to about 14, they would be, given to some family relative, almost like a mentorship, where they start learning all sorts of things, including etiquette, but also horse riding and discipline, okay, and doing duties. And then from about 14 on, this is when you can see them as squires, and they're engaged in full-on combat warfare. Not exactly what kids do today, with their Game Boys and video games, but so they would be engaged in that sort of thing, very edifying, very fulfilling, until about 21, when they were knighted, essentially. And this is the same story for Godfrey, but we also learn that through his youth, he was just seen as an immensely stalwart warrior. According, they'll say legend, but according to the sources, multiple sources, with one sword stroke, he split a Turk vertically, okay? And one part, a Turk on a horse, and one part slipped off and the other part dangled on the horse. And, all the Muslims and the Turks freaked out because it ran back into Antioch looking like that. So he fought a bear. He was, I think, even when I wrote Two Swords of Christ, I mentioned him as a sort of predecessor of the Knights of the Temple. He's the kind of guy they were modeling because he also was monastic, that he never got married because he was constantly involved in warfare. Due to his piety, he was elected to become the first king of Jerusalem, and he refused it on condition that he not be called king and instead be called defender or protector of the Holy Sepulchre. And he famously said, I will not wear a crown of gold where my Savior wore a crown of thorns. Okay, so that's the kind of man that he was, and he continued fighting. And when he was elected, people think this is, again, it's funny because we were told, oh, they went to the Holy Land to conquer land. This was about land. Actually, a lot of them, once they had liberated it, all they wanted to do was go back home, including Godfrey. So it was seen as a sacrifice to stay there. Instead of going back home to your loved ones and safety and your lands, you stay in this desert with hostile people all around you in constant warfare. Not exactly a great deal, or a great bargain. But he chose it, he opted for it, and he died. He only lasted for a year before he finally died. And without giving too much away, but there's good reason to believe he was poisoned by a Muslim. If you wanted the deepest dive of the Crusades, it's the Two Swords of Christ, but it also gets into the religious theology behind it, the rationale, the Christian rationale of warfare that we're talking about, because so many people don't, how can you be a Christian and fight back? Well, you're going to see that these guys were as pious as they come, kind of like what I just, even more so, from Godfrey, what I described, because they literally took vows of monks, but they were just the most, like berserk on the field in warfare. So how did they rationalize it? So I definitely get into the theology of that, but it even goes way beyond the First Crusade, because at least one of those orders outlasted the First Crusade, the Crusades, and actually still alive till this day, the Knights of St. John, of course.